Hey friends, welcome back to the MARANATHA Global Bible Study on the Rapture and the Endurance of the Saints. In last week's session, we took some time to discuss what is dispensationalism and why it must die. Okay, now to be clear, if you don't know what dispensationalism is, we're going to briefly review that again before we start here. But in essence, dispensationalism is a system of theology that was formulated and articulated by a man named John Nelson Darby, first in the 1830s. And this system of belief is the foundation for the pre-tribulational rapture that's so popular in the church today, an idea that, again, as I've said so many times, is fundamentally unbiblical. And so dispensationalism, although there are many aspects of dispensationalism that I agree with, there are aspects of it, there are doctrines that are common to dispensationalism that I disagree with so vehemently that I'm convinced that the Lord is going to crush dispensationalism before his return, and the church will and must return to a more proper, biblical, historic premillennialism. Okay, so as promised, in this session, we're going to take the time to review 3 books. Actually, not in this session, but over the next few sessions. We're going to review the following 3 books. The first one is called Ancient Dispensational Truth by James Morris. And in this book, he's trying to claim that dispensationalism was taught before John Nelson Darby, before the 1830s. So he goes back to very ancient sources and says, see, look, that's dispensational doctrine, or this guy was teaching dispensational doctrine, or this type of thing, and trying to say that dispensationalism actually predates John Nelson Darby. Well, then we're going to look at another book which is a bit more academic. I mean, it's far more responsible than Morris's book. And this one is by William C. Watson. It's called Dispensationalism Before Darby. And this has become, in many ways, kind of a popular manual among dispensationalists who have been wanting to defend dispensationalism. So the idea is really this. John Nelson Darby in the 1830s, he didn't come up with something new, right? This is what these guys are trying to say. He didn't come up with something new at all. He simply reclaimed that which the ancient church believed. So the idea is, no, dispensationalism was the belief of the early ancient church. It was the belief of the apostles and Jesus. John Nelson Darby simply kind of like a reformer, kind of like Luther or something. He reclaimed ancient biblical truth. And so thus dispensationalists today would say, I believe exactly what the apostles believed. And then finally, not in this session, but beginning next week, we'll begin looking at this brand new book that just came out called Discovering Dispensationalism. This is by far the most responsible and academic, the most quality of all 3 of these books. Unfortunately, they did tap William C. Watson, the author of Dispensationalism Before Darby, to cover a broad period of church history over 1,000 years, or roughly 1,000 years. And he, again, continues with what we'll see is his very, very careless, sloppy, and arguably dishonest scholarship, as we'll see. We'll really see that when we begin next week. So those are the 3 books that we're going to review. Now, before we jump in, again, I just want to very briefly review what dispensationalism is. So I've got this chart here. You've got 7 unique doctrines, or 7 distinct doctrines listed. Now, the first 4 doctrines, to be clear, I agree with them. I think they're biblical. And they all fall under the heading of historic premillennialism. This is the idea that the early church believed these things. The early church writers after the apostles, they believed all of these things. Then you have in the sort of lilac or purple, you've got 3 other distinct doctrines, and those are all unique to dispensationalism. So to be clear, what is the difference between dispensationalism and just simple historic premillennialism? Well, dispensationalism believes everything that historic premillennialism does, but it adds a few unique, distinct doctrines. The first is that there is this very, very harsh, rigid distinction, this clear wall of separation between the church and Israel. Never shall the two ever cross. Secondly, the New Testament should be interpreted, it should be understood as being divided between passages that are for Israel or for the Jews and passages that are for the church. Passages that are not for us. We don't need to pay attention to those. They don't apply to us because that's for Israel. And then these other passages are for us, this type of thing. I think that is a profoundly dangerous, even cultic, false doctrine that the church needs to shed and get rid of. And then finally, the pre-tribulational rapture that is so popular in the church today, which is tied into these previous two doctrines. Of course, that's probably the most popular, well-known doctrine, unique and distinct to dispensationalism. So to be clear, all 7 of these doctrines together form dispensationalism. I, again, am advocating for historic premillennialism. Let's just do away. Let's just do away with the term dispensationalism. Too much baggage, too much weirdness with John Nelson Darby and so many of those that followed after him, E.W. Bullinger, some of these hyper-dispensationalists, getting into all kinds of really mundane, strange arguments. Let's just do away with all of that. I believe that before Jesus returns, the church will, in fact, I believe it must reclaim the ancient apostolic doctrine of historic premillennialism. Okay, I've also got a neat little chart here. Again, just because I made this, I want to share it with you all again. This is a very simple overview of the primary eschatology that dominated at any given point in church history. So again, you begin at the beginning, the first few hundred years of church history, Papias, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Lactantius, Victorinus, Tertullian. These guys were all premillennialists. Now, there were others in the first few hundred years who were not premillennialists, but premillennialism clearly dominated the first few hundred years of church history after the apostles. Then, through the influence of the Alexandrian school, the school that was much more influenced by Greek Platonic philosophy, in other words, Gnosticism, or more of an allegorical, spiritualized interpretation of the Bible, those who rejected a literal millennium, those who rejected a literal future earthly reign of Jesus, and these type of things, after Augustine, amillennialism became the dominant eschatology of the church for 1,300 years. Amillennialism, the A, whereas our British friends say amillennialism, the A means no. It means none. So the idea is there is no literal millennium. We're in the millennium now. The millennium should simply be interpreted spiritually or allegorically. We are in it now. And I always have to tell this little joke, by the way. When I was in Scotland a few years ago, after I taught on the differences between premillennialism and amillennialism, this very sweet little, again, I can't remember if she was Scottish or Irish, came up to me, and just this, sweet little white-haired woman, and she said, "Oh, Joel, you're so right, because if the millennium is now, then the millennium really sucks." And I was like, she gets it, okay? For any of us who live with the burden of this current age, who live with long-term illness or sickness, for those of us who feel the sigh and the groan of living in this fallen, broken, corrupt age, it's a real hard sell to say we are in the kingdom now. This is it. You go, if this is it, then this kind of stinks. I sure hope something far, far better is coming, and not simply someday we die and go to heaven forever. I believe the scriptures actually hold out very clear promises of very real, physical, material blessings on the earth, right? So that's amillennialism. And then you get up to, in the red, you get up to the Reformation period, and I call this the period of confusion. Now, to be very clear, it doesn't mean that everyone was confused. It just means that when you start trying to understand what was the dominant view of the end times, what was the dominant eschatology from the time of the Reformation for the next couple hundred years, it's very confused. Their ideas are all over the place. You had guys who were sort of studying the Bible, now returning to studying the scriptures, and they start recognizing the multitude of problems with amillennialism. So they started embracing elements of premillennialism, elements of postmillennialism. That's the idea that the world is just getting more and more Christian as we move forward. The gospel is conquering the world, and we're going to establish ourselves essentially a golden era of Christianity on the earth. And then after that, Jesus returns. That's this very triumphalistic, sort of positive perspective. They started embracing elements, or some of them, or many of them did, elements of postmillennialism. Others remained amillennialist. Others were premillennialist. You have a lot of different ideas. Then you get to John Nelson Darby. You get to the 1830s. As I said in last week's session, the guy was very charismatic. He was clearly brilliant, and he had a lot of energy. He had a lot of ambition. And so he, as I said, he essentially formulated and articulated dispensational premillennialism, or you could say pre-tribulational dispensational premillennialism, which is to say the church is going to be raptured 7 years before the return of Jesus. So from the time of John Nelson Darby and then his protege, Cyrus Scofield, he wrote the Scofield Reference Bible. These guys traveled all over the world, all over the United States, really popularized dispensationalism, really won a lot of people. So I'm going to say over the past 100 years or so, the church is relatively divided down the line. Now, there's many, many people that fall in other categories, but relatively divided between premillennialists and amillennialists. Postmillennialism is a much smaller segment, okay? But for the most part, probably half of the church today hold to dispensationalism. And the vast majority, of course, also hold to the pre-tribulational rapture, okay? So, with that said, we've got a basic understanding of what dispensationalism is. Now we're going to begin the critical review of these first two books. Now, to begin, why are we reviewing these, or why were these books even written in the first place? We have to begin with what I call the great embarrassment, okay? Because it really is. Dispensationalists are profoundly embarrassed by the fact that it is such a new doctrine, that it came out of this century, this era, this period in American history in particular, where so many strange end-time doctrines and ideas emerged. You had the Millerites. These guys were constantly predicting the date of the return of Jesus, constantly getting it wrong. You had the Jehovah's Witnesses emerged out of this period. You had the Mormons that emerged out of this period. These were both very eschatologically end-time-driven movements. And then, of course, out of the same period, you had Darbyism or dispensationalism, and this very new idea of a pre-tribulational rapture. Now, to be very clear, again, I want to reiterate, I agree with many aspects of dispensationalism. I simply say, let's shed the term dispensationalism and let's use the term historic premillennialism. The main issue that is incredibly embarrassing for pre-tribulationists, those who believe the rapture is 7 years before the return of Jesus, is that you cannot find any examples of a pre-tribulational rapture throughout church history until John Nelson Darby. You simply cannot find any. Now, there are some examples of a view of the rapture that are maybe mid-trib, or they are partial raptures where just the righteous get caught up, but the sort of nominal Christians all get left behind. Some have sort of a pre-wrath, or as I said, mid-tribulational perspective, but you won't find anyone who articulates a pre-tribulational rapture as it's popularly taught today. You simply won't, and that is incredibly embarrassing. Now, to be absolutely clear, again, I want to state this. It doesn't matter what anyone has believed ever throughout history. The only thing that matters is what does the Word of God say. That said, and I've said this multiple times, I don't simply value what the Holy Spirit says to me in terms of enlightening and helping me to understand the Scriptures. I also pay attention. Humility mandates that we pay attention to what the Holy Spirit has been speaking to His church throughout history. And, so that we don't go like, hey, I have a revelation, I understand this, everyone else is wrong. We go, do you think you're the only person in church history that the Lord has spoken to? So we have to pay attention to what the Lord has been speaking to His church. And when you go, we can't find a single example of anyone who believed this for well over 1,000 years, you go, something might be wrong here. especially those who lived closest to the apostles. There's no example of a pre-tribulational rapture ever taught in church history, and that's incredibly embarrassing, right? So for that reason, these guys have written these books to try to manufacture and, if you will, create the illusion that the earliest of the ancient church was actually, they espoused dispensationalism. And it's quite frankly, it's a bizarre argument. I have no problem at all saying there are there are aspects of dispensational thought and ideas that you'll see throughout church history. That's absolutely true. But you will not find the system of dispensationalism ever taught. You won't find anything really even close. And as I said, you certainly won't find the pre-tribulational rapture taught. So let's go ahead and begin with the first book, again by Morris, Ancient Dispensational Truth. I want to be very clear, this book is the least academic, it's the least careful, it's the least responsible of any of the three books. It's a mess, quite frankly. It's very poorly very poorly argued. Let's just put it this way. The scholarship in the book is bad. It's bad.
Hey guys, thanks for watching this Maranatha Global Bible Study. We wanted to interrupt the study real quick to say this. We have a lot more than just Bible studies available. If you head over to faistudios.org or you go to any major app platform and type in Frontier Alliance International, you're going to get a centralized place with a wealth of resources, from feature films to documentaries to podcasts to books to art to store to training, a ton of resources that's free and free forever, both on the web and on the app platform as well. So make sure you go check it out. Thanks for watching. Now back to the teaching.
So the subtitle of the book is Refuting the Myth that Dispensationalism is New. Guys, you can't refute the fact that dispensationalism is new. It just is. Again, I want to be clear, because dispensationalism is a system. It's a system of several interlocking, interconnected doctrines. It's a system. It's not a single doctrine. You can't point to one idea that's important to dispensationalism and find some guy that goes, well, he agrees with that idea. Therefore, dispensationalism is ancient. That's horrible, horrible logic. Dispensationalism is a system. If you want to say dispelling the notion that dispensational ideas or doctrines are new, you can say that. That's fine. But to say that dispensationalism is anything other than new is profoundly anachronistic. Okay, in other words, it doesn't work with time. You're required to take this part of history and move it back here, and it just does not work. Okay, and it's silliness, quite frankly. It's like if someone, again, I used this argument or I articulated this argument in last week's session. Muslims say that Islam is the ancient primordial religion of all faithful men and women of God throughout history. So they'll say Jesus was a Muslim. Jesus espoused the same doctrines as Muhammad. Now, they would say the core essence of Islam is monotheism, one God. So they would say Jesus was a Muslim. They'll say Moses was a Muslim. Any of the various biblical prophets, Noah, they'll say, was a Muslim. Well, that's absolutely silliness, okay? Why? Because Islam does not exist before Muhammad. Muhammad articulated and popularized Islam, period. If you you can point to different aspects of Islamic thought in history, but to say that Islam is ancient is simply anachronistic. It's silly. Likewise, you could say Charles Taze Russell. He was the founder. He was really the founder of Jehovah's Witnesses, or you could say Watchtower theology. The very suggestion that Jehovah's Witness theology, Watchtower theology, predates or precedes Russell is anachronistic. It's silly. Like, no scholar would ever agree with that. Now, you can find aspects of Jehovah's Witness theology in history. You can find annihilationism. They believe that when people die, they just cease to exist, or that the wicked just get wiped out. You can find Arianism, the idea that Jesus isn't really God. You can find that in church history. But these guys were not Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay? They did not espouse Watchtower theology. They only espoused aspects of it, but not the system of theology today that's known as Watchtower theology. Likewise, You can find aspects of dispensational thought, of course, throughout history, but you will not find dispensationalism. It's really silly. So that's the main point. And again, I articulated that in last week's session. So here's a chart that I also included. And again, these are the 7 interlocking primary doctrines of dispensationalism. The point is this: these are all interconnected, interrelated. One doctrine relies on the other doctrines in order for dispensationalists to say they're true, right? They're all interconnected, and you can't just sub one out. Now, here is the table of contents for Morris's work. So he has 6 chapters. He says, in the first chapter, he says, look, we find belief in dispensations, or different eras or periods of history where God deals with mankind differently. And I go, okay, so you find people that believed in different dispensations. That doesn't mean they espoused Darbyism. That doesn't mean they espoused dispensationalism. It just means they believe that history is divided up between different periods. So, you can see what he's doing is he's trying to find elements of each of these different dispensational doctrines, but he's never trying to argue that the system exists. Then he says, well, we can find many who utilized a more literal hermeneutic. In other words, they interpret the Bible more literally. I go, hey, that's great. You can find many individuals that were against replacement theology. I go, that's fantastic. I mean, I have argued vociferously against replacement theology, and so that's wonderful when we find examples of it. You had many that believe in an end-time restoration of Israel or a future restoration of Israel. Wonderful. Those who believe that all of Daniel's 70th week was future. I go, I agree with that. But then he has chapter 6 dedicated to a pre-trib rapture, saying that the pre-trib rapture was taught in ancient history. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at this, but very simply, he only highlights 2 individuals in church history. He says that Irenaeus and Victorinus, that these 2 guys were pre-trib, or that they taught a pre-trib rapture. Now, I've taken a session to go through each one of these individuals, and I showed that there is absolutely no way in heaven or hell that these guys were pre-tribbers, period. Like, it's absurd. Genuinely absurd. Now, let's go ahead and just touch on a couple of these. So here's Irenaeus in his book Against Heresies. He says, the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, who have received no kingdom as of yet, but they shall receive power as if kings 1 hour with the beast. So he quotes the book of Revelation, and then he goes on to say this, and they, who's they? The 10 kings under the authority of the Antichrist, he says, they shall lay Babylon waste, burn her with fire. They will give their kingdom to the beast, and they will put the church to flight. Irenaeus has the church on the earth facing the persecution of the Antichrist. Irenaeus did not believe in a pre-tribulational rapture, period. Okay, there's a few statements that Irenaeus makes that are a bit confusing, or that make you scratch your head or go, maybe he contradicts himself a little bit, but he clearly was not espousing a pre-tribulational rapture. Here's a statement from Tommy Ice, Dr. Tommy Ice, who, again, to be clear, is the director, the founder and director of the Pre-Tribulational Research Center. He's probably the most well-known pre-trib scholar out there. And this is what Dr. Ice says. He says, when taken within the context of all of Irenaeus' writings, it appears that he was not teaching pre-tribulationism. And I agree. I agree with Dr. Tommy. But Dr. Tommy clearly disagrees with James Morris. And then Victorinus, in his commentary on the Apocalypse, the commentary on the book of Revelation, chapter 20. And I'm just reading one quote from each of these guys. Again, I did a whole session on each one of these. He says, this little season signifies 3 years and 6 months, so 3.5 years, in which with all his power the devil will avenge himself under Antichrist against the church. So Victorinus believed that the church would be persecuted by the Antichrist for the last 3.5 years, right up until the end of the tribulation. He was not a mid-tribber. He was not a pre-wrather. He was a post-tribber through and through. So in this entire book, the only examples that he gives to try to defend the pre-tribulational rapture is, he spends pages trying to twist what Irenaeus had to say, and then a few pages trying to twist what Victorinus had to say. Guys, it's horrible scholarship. Like, again, even other pre-tribbers like Dr. Tommy are honest enough, even though they're eager to try to find pre-tribulational statements. They go, guys, no. Irenaeus, Victorinus, they were not pre-tribbers, period. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and move on to the far more respectable, far more well-known book, Dispensationalism, before Darby. Now, let me just begin by saying this. Watson's effort is to show that there are some elements of dispensationalism that were taught before the 1800s, before the 19th century. And again, we just have to reiterate the fact that dispensationalism is a system. It's a system. Showing that elements of it were taught proves nothing other than that aspects of dispensationalism are valid, but it doesn't validate the entire system. This is so important. Like, it's almost like a card trick. It's almost like a sleight of hand to say, we will prove that dispensationalism is ancient. And then you don't even try. You just go, see, look, there's aspects of it. I go, that's like a card trick. Don't say, refuting the myth that dispensationalism is new, when you're not even trying to prove that. Like, it's even just in the way the whole argument is framed, it's kind of very misleading. Watson desperately tries, but absolutely fails to find any evidence of a pre-tribulational rapture. I want to be absolutely clear. Many responsible, guys that I like, they've gone, well, you need to read this book. It shows you that there was all kinds of pre-tribulationism that was taught before Darby. Watson tries desperately, and he fails miserably. Now, some of you are watching this, you go, but Joel, that wasn't even the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book is not to prove the pre-tribulational rapture. You're arguing against something that he was not trying to do. And I say nonsense. Here's the back of the book. Here's the back of the book, and the very first endorsement. How does Heinsohn understand Watson's book? This is his endorsement. He says, William Watson plows new ground in researching the history of eschatological thought prior to the 19th century. We go, yes. And then he goes, to put it simply, Darby did not invent the pre-tribulational rapture idea. Okay, so if there's one thing that Dr. Heinsohn could say to try to give a good thumbs up, props to the book, is he goes, let's just be very clear. Watson shows that the pre-tribulational rapture is not new. Guys, that's nonsense. Here's another, again, just to understand how the book is received. Here's another review. It's actually the first review that I looked up on Amazon, the very first one. This individual says, as mentioned in the first paragraph, a common argument against dispensationalism, parentheses, and the pre-tribulational rapture, is that it was invented by John Nelson Darby around 1830. That's absolutely true. It was. He was the one who articulated it. Now, again, he was drawing from some different weird ideas. There was all kinds of crazy ideas before him. People that believed in a partial rapture or a mid-tribulational rapture or sometimes a pre-wrath rapture. He was drawing from all kinds of different ideas, but he is the first one that articulates the pre-tribulational rapture, the idea that we would be raptured 7 years before the return of Jesus, before the tribulation completely. You don't find that anywhere in church history before Darby. You don't. But look what this reviewer says. Watson proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that this popular belief, the idea that Darbyism is new, is absolutely false, and those who promote it grossly mischaracterize church history. You see what I'm saying, guys? Pre-tribbers pick this book up and they go, proof. But this is the problem with confirmation bias. They want to believe it, and even when they are presented with horrible evidence, they latch onto it and they say, see, how's this guy say it? Beyond any shadow of a doubt. And anyone who disagrees grossly mischaracterized church history. let's go ahead now and let's review this proof that Watson has provided for us. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin. He has 2 chapters in which he's trying to find evidence of a pre-tribulational rapture. Chapter 7 and chapter 10. The first chapter is called Concepts of a Pre-Tribulational Rapture in 17th Century England. Again, a pre-tribulation, the very word there means a rapture before the tribulation. But so he says concepts of a pre-tribulational rapture in 17th and tribulation in 17th century England. And then chapter 10 is called the pre-tribulational rapture and tribulation in 18th century England. So he's got 2 chapters, again, covering 200 years. Now, I've got an actual picture from the book, and I just put the picture in here and I highlighted it in yellow. Now, here's the thing. Between these two chapters, Watson goes through over 20 individuals. Over 20 individuals, and there's only 6. This is what's so bizarre, that he actually says teach a pre-tribulational rapture. So here, as you in this picture from the book, you can see here, he says, those who are clearly taught or espoused or articulated a pre-trib rapture. And he only lists 6 guys. So these are the cream of the crop. These are the best of the best that Watson has to offer. Okay, let's look at each one of these 6. These are the best that he has to offer. In this 200-year period, he says these guys clearly taught a pre-trib rapture. Now, what's funny about Watson is that he uses this word clearly all the time. And that to me is not scholarship. That's polemics. That's apologetics. You're trying to convince the person. And you don't really have evidence, so you say clearly. And then you look at it and you go, this ain't clear at all. Why does he keep saying clearly? Like it's bad. Like it's not teaching a pre-tribulational rapture, period. And you go, clearly he is. And I go, you can use all of the heightened adjectives and I guess adverbs, but it doesn't prove anything. You have to prove it from the evidence itself.
Hey guys, Stephanie here. I want to interrupt for just a moment to tell you about the Mobilization Initiative. The Mobilization Initiative is near and dear to all of our hearts. It's precious to us in the FAI family. 20 years ago, the epicenter of explosive gospel growth in the world was in the Global South. Now, the first, second, third fastest growing churches in the world are in the Middle East, the 1040 window, in the Muslim world, and that's incredible. And what we have found is that the Lord has raised up a multitude, a generation of worthy laborers from the Global South who know how to pray, they know how to preach, and they know how to work hard, but they are from countries that have a lower GDP than, say, where I am from. And so they don't have the financial support to be sent and sustained on the field. So the Mobilization Initiative connects the financial resources of the West to send and support full-time, long-term laborers from the Global South to the Middle East, to the Muslim world, and in the 1040 window. Head to faistudios.org to jump in on the Mobilization Initiative. Maranatha.
So let's go ahead and look at Ephraim Hewitt. This is in 1643. Again, this is the first individual that Watson says clearly taught a pre-trib rapture. Here's a statement from Ephraim. He says, deliverance from outward trials is expressed by the Lord coming in the clouds. Okay, so he says the church will be delivered from trials, from tribulation, when Jesus returns in the clouds. Now watch this. And then he says, our Lord, in Matthew 24, verse 30, and his beloved disciple, John, in Revelation 1:10, do couple this coming of the Son of Man in the clouds with the wailing, in other words, the repentance of the Jews. Here's the problem, guys. Matthew 24, verse 30 is when? After the tribulation. Matthew 24, verse 29 says, immediately after the tribulation. And then verse 30 says, then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in the clouds. Right? But Watson says that Hewitt was clearly pre-trib. Hewitt was post-trib. Like unarguably, he places the rapture at the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds, Matthew 24, verse 30, something that every pre-tribber out there right now would thoroughly deny. Okay, so here's the 6th cream of the crop. The first one, cross it off the list. The guy was post-trib. Next, you have Captain John Brown, 1654. Again, this is the next individual that Watson says was clearly pre-trib. And then here's another picture from the book where Watson actually says Brown believed in a premillennial mid-tribulational rapture. You go, wait a minute. What did he believe in? A mid-trib rapture or pre-trib? The third individual is John Berchentia. That's in 1660. Again, he's the third individual that Watson said was clearly pre-trib. Watson says, now watch this. Again, you can't make this stuff up. At the end of the chapter, Watson says he was clearly pre-trib. But earlier in the chapter, here's what Watson says. John Berchentia believed that the 1,260 days or years of Daniel ended in 1641, marking the beginning of the great battle of Armageddon, which he understood to be the English Civil War, when the saints began to fight back against the forces of the Antichrist. He believed in many comings of Christ. This is what I mean by the age of confusion. You can't just pull out some weird fringe guy who believed that the English Civil War was Armageddon, who believed in many comings of Christ, and go, yeah, see, this guy's just like any dispensationalist today or Joel Rosenberg. No! This is just some kook who had weird ideas. He was very confused. You can't point to him and say, see, we've had guys on our team all the way back to the 1600s. Like, you just scratch your head and you go, why are you even quoting this guy? Why would you even claim him? He was obviously confused. He clearly did not teach a pre-tribulational rapture. As Watson says, he believed in many comings of Christ. Number 4 is Samuel. Oh, I said Huntington. It's Hutchinson. My bad. In 1667. Here's Watson's statement. He says his order of events was first the tribulation, then the rapture, then Armageddon. Tribulation, rapture, Armageddon. He did not put the rapture before the tribulation. You can't say that he was pre-tribulational. This is another example where Watson contradicts himself. You can't say he was clearly pre-trib and then on another page admit that he believed the rapture happened after the tribulation. Hutchinson was 100% post-trib, to be clear. I'm going to read a couple of his statements. He says, when we see the people of God in such distress, that's tribulation, as was never known in the world. Now again, he's quoting the words of Jesus. There will be tribulation such as has never been since there was a nation until that time. He says, then we may look for Christ's appearance for the deliverance of them. So when the church is in the midst of the worst tribulation that has ever been known, then we should look for the appearance, the parousia of Christ to deliver them, right? So you go, well, he could be pre-wrath, he could be mid-trib, but sometime in the midst of the tribulation, he says we should look for the appearance of Christ. Now let's read another statement that he says. He says in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 1, the saints will be gathered together unto him, according to that in Matthew 24, verse 31. Again, that's Samuel Hutchinson. When does he place the rapture? He says it's Matthew 24, verse 31, which we've already reviewed, happens when? After the tribulation. Please read Matthew 24, verse 29 through 31. Every pre-tribber across the boards would say that has nothing to do with the rapture, even though it clearly does. Even though Paul the Apostle in 1 Thessalonians 4 is clearly expounding upon the words of Jesus there in Matthew 24, 29 through 31. Okay? Hutchinson was 100% post-trib. This is the best that Watson can offer. Someone who says the rapture will happen after the tribulation. There's nothing pre-trib here at all. You go, what is this guy thinking? Then we get to the fifth example, Joshua Sprigg. Here's Watson's quote. He says, Joshua Sprigg hinted at a secret coming of Christ before his glorious appearance. The best that he can come up with is he says that he hinted at it. He hinted at it. In fact, when you read what Joshua Sprigg had to say, you go, no, you're just misunderstanding him like you misunderstand everyone. That's the best that he can come up with is a hint. And again, I would look at his example of a hint. I would say there's no hint here at all. He was not a pre-tribber. And then finally, we get to Sayarud. This is actually in 1734. This is really the only good example that he can come up with in the 18th century. Again, this is the last of the individuals. The last of the individuals in the entire book that Watson says was clearly pre-trib. Watson refers to Rudd as a Baptist pastor and physician, taught that Christ will descend several times. Several times. Again, a careful analysis of what he had to write. He was not pre-trib. He was confused. Why would you want to claim someone as being on your team, as supporting your doctrine, who was so confused to believe that Jesus was going to make several descents, that he would return many times? So again, guys, we just went through all 6 of Watson's best examples. He says all of them were clearly, there it is, clearly pre-trib. Not a single one of them is. This is the best that Watson can offer. In conclusion, I want to read a statement from Tommy Ice and Timothy Denny. This is from an article that's on Dr. Ice's website. He says, is pre-tribulationism, in other words, the doctrine of the pre-tribulational rapture, he says, is it as theologically bankrupt as its critics profess? Or are there answers to these charges? If there are reasonable answers, then the burden of proof and historical argumentation shifts back to the critics, of which I am one. Rapture critics must acknowledge and interact with the historical and theological evidence. That's exactly what I'm doing right now. I'm interacting with the evidence, and I've debunked it. I've gone through each one, and I've shown that none of them are even real. This is embarrassing. This is not scholarship. Watson was not a careful scholar. He should not be held up as a scholar. In fact, I actually believe this is such a mess that if dispensationalists want to gain any measure of credibility, they actually should repudiate him. They should actually say, like, Watson is not reliable. He might have been a great guy, might have been a great brother, but in terms of his scholarship, it's really poor. And so I'm going to end that right here. In next week's session, we're going to continue working through some of these various claims of pre-tribulationism in history, and then we will get to, whether we'll get to it next week or not, we'll get to this book, which, as I said, is a much better book. It's actually an excellent book. I recommend it. Obviously, I don't agree with everything, especially Watson's part in the book, but it is a very good book. So that's all the time that we have for this week. I trust that you're all blessed and doing well. Look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, guys, God bless you all, and Maranatha.